If DOJ doesn't release the files it has by next Friday, is there anything Congress can do to compel that to happen?
Well, I mean, it's a crime if they don't. It's not like they're in contempt of Congress because they didn't respond to a subpoena. This is a new law with, criminal implications if they don't follow it. But I was encouraged, again, by the fact that they went back to these 3 judges and got the judges to release the grand jury material to the DOJ.
Thank you.
Is that grand jury material enough, do you think,
No.
to comply with the law?
No, the grand jury material is just a small fraction of what the DOJ needs to release, because the FBI and DOJ probably has evidence that they chose not to take to the grand jury, because the evidence they're in possession of would implicate other people, not Epstein or Maxwell. So the grand jury material is probably going to just be mostly facts and evidence that was used to convict.
Listen to what this congressman is saying, because this is not some conspiracy theorist rambling on the internet. This is an elected member of the United States House of Representatives, stating in plain language that the Department of Justice is actively concealing evidence because that evidence would implicate powerful people beyond Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And if that doesn't make your blood boil, then you haven't been paying attention to the systematic architecture of elite impunity that has been constructed over decades in this country, while the rest of us are told to believe in equal justice under law. The Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the Department of Justice to make publicly available all files pertaining to the prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein within 30 days of passage, which means the law was signed by President Donald Trump on November 9, and the clock is ticking toward a deadline that could finally expose the rot at the heart of American power. Except you just heard Representative Massie explain precisely why the grand jury material isn't enough, because the FBI and DOJ deliberately withheld evidence from those grand juries in the first place to protect the names that would destroy reputations, end political careers, and shatter the illusion that our institutions serve justice rather than power. And here's where it gets absolutely explosive, because Trump and other Republicans launched a pressure campaign to prevent the release of the files, with one anonymous official calling voting for Massie's discharge petition a very hostile act to the administration, which means that when this story was breaking wide open, we had the sitting President of the United States actively working to suppress the evidence that his own Department of Justice was supposed to release under a law he himself signed. Think about the audacity of that maneuver, the sheer contempt for accountability, because if they have ongoing investigations in certain areas, those documents can't be released. So this might be a big smokescreen, these investigations, to open a bunch of them as a last-ditch effort to prevent the release of the Epstein files, which is exactly what Massie warned about when Trump ordered the DOJ to investigate Epstein's involvement with banks and prominent Democratic figures, conveniently creating legal barriers to transparency by launching new probes right as the deadline approached. And before anyone tries to dismiss this as partisan grandstanding, you need to understand that the discharge petition received signatures from 4 Republican representatives and 214 Democratic Party representatives, forcing this vote against the explicit wishes of Republican leadership, who wanted this buried forever. You want to talk about bipartisan corruption, about how both parties are complicit in protecting the powerful predators who move through our society with absolute impunity, then study this case, because here you have Massie fighting the Speaker, the President, the Vice President, the FBI Director, and the Attorney General on this, as they all turned against the notion of releasing the Epstein files, which reveals that when the chips are down and the names of the truly powerful are at stake, the entire machinery of government closes ranks to protect its own. This is not about Republican versus Democrat. This is about the political class versus the rest of us, about a system that talks endlessly about accountability, while constructing labyrinthine mechanisms to ensure that accountability never reaches those who yacht with billionaires and fly on private jets to private islands where unspeakable crimes were committed against children, while the FBI and DOJ collected evidence and then decided which evidence would see the light of day and which evidence would remain locked away because releasing it would implicate people they were never going to charge. And the numbers here are staggering, because between January 2025 and July 2025, FBI personnel worked 4,737 overtime hours, costing the U.S. government over $851,000 to redact files related to the Epstein investigation, which means that while Americans struggle to afford health care and housing and education, the federal government spent nearly $1 million in overtime alone just to black out the names of powerful men who participated in or enabled a child sex trafficking network. Let that sink in, because this is your tax dollars at work, protecting the elite from the consequences of their actions. This is the operational definition of a two-tiered justice system, where ordinary people get prosecuted for marijuana possession, while senators and CEOs and foreign dignitaries get their names redacted from documents that would prove their complicity in crimes against children, the FBI conducted what it called an exhaustive review, and the scope was massive, covering over 300 gigabytes of data and physical evidence, and yet somehow the conclusion is always the same, which is that most of this material cannot be released because of grand jury secrecy, or national security, or victim privacy, or any of the other convenient legal doctrines that metamorphose into shields for the powerful whenever accountability comes knocking. Now pay very close attention to what Representative Massie said in that clip, because his logic exposes the fundamental problem with how these investigations are conducted, and how prosecutors exercise discretionary power that operates beyond democratic oversight or meaningful accountability, and what he's describing is prosecutorial capture, where the Department of Justice becomes not an instrument of justice, but an instrument of elite protection. He explains that the grand jury material is only going to include evidence that was used to convict Epstein and Maxwell, which means everything else, all the evidence pointing to other perpetrators and enablers and co-conspirators, was consciously excluded from the grand jury process because federal prosecutors made the calculated decision not to pursue those leads. This is how the system works when you really examine it. This is how power insulates itself from consequence, because prosecutors have nearly unlimited discretion to decide who gets investigated and who doesn't, who gets charged and who doesn't, which evidence gets presented to a grand jury, and which evidence gets filed away in a vault where it can be redacted and withheld and protected by legal doctrines that were originally designed to protect the innocent, but have been weaponized to protect the guilty. And this connects to a much larger crisis in American governance that has been accelerating throughout 2025, because since January 2025, the DOJ leadership has gutted the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division, an office created in response to the Watergate scandal that has combated public corruption for nearly 50 years, which reveals that we are witnessing not random failures of accountability, but systematic dismantling of the institutional mechanisms that were built to prevent precisely this kind of elite impunity. The Watergate reforms created internal accountability structures within the Justice Department because Americans demanded that kind of oversight after Nixon's abuses, and now those same structures are being hollowed out by an administration that views accountability as an obstacle rather than a foundation of democratic legitimacy. The formal and informal internal accountability systems the department developed in the wake of the Watergate scandal to serve as checks against abuses of its immense powers and law enforcement authorities are now disregarded by the current administrations, and when you combine that with what we're seeing in the Epstein files case, you get a crystal clear picture of deliberate institutional capture, designed to ensure that the powerful can commit crimes without fear of prosecution. The reporting reveals even more disturbing details, because the House Oversight Committee released over 20,000 documents, including email and text messages from Epstein, many of which mentioned Trump, and the president's response was calling the files a hoax and pressuring his attorney general to investigate Democrats instead of releasing the full evidentiary record. This is the authoritarian playbook playing out in real time, the projection and deflection and weaponization of investigative power against political opponents, while simultaneously blocking the release of information that would expose your own connections to a convicted sex trafficker. And before Trump supporters try to claim this is just about protecting victims or preventing fake news, you need to reckon with the fact that Massie said he believes Trump is trying to protect friends and donors, and by the way, these aren't necessarily Republican, which confirms what we've known all along, which is that the Epstein network cuts across party lines and ideological boundaries, because it exists at the level of class power where billionaires and politicians and corporate titans socialize together in spaces ordinary Americans never access. Now let's talk about what Massie predicts will happen when these files finally come out, because in the United States we may see names coming off of buildings and scholarships being renamed, because rich and powerful men are going to be caught finally and see some justice for the victims, which gives you a sense of how deep this network penetrates American institutional life. We're not talking about fringe figures here. We're talking about people whose names are on university buildings and hospital wings and museum galleries, people who have shaped public policy and directed billions of dollars and wielded enormous influence over our political and economic systems while simultaneously participating in or enabling a child sex trafficking network that operated with virtual impunity for decades. And the reason it operated with impunity is precisely because of the institutional capture we're discussing, because when the FBI investigates these crimes, they collect evidence on everyone involved, but then prosecutors make selective charging decisions based not on the evidence but on calculations about who is too powerful to prosecute, who has too many connections, whose prosecution would embarrass too many important people or disrupt too many lucrative relationships. The scope of what's being concealed becomes even clearer when you understand that the law requires the Attorney General to make publicly available all unclassified records, documents, communications, and investigative materials in the possession of the Department of Justice that relate to Jeffrey Epstein, including all investigations, prosecutions, or custodial matters, and that specifically includes individuals, including government officials, named or referenced in connection with Epstein's criminal activities, civil settlements, immunity or plea agreements, or investigatory proceedings. This is comprehensive disclosure that would expose not just the perpetrators, but the entire infrastructure of enablement and protection that allowed Epstein to operate for so long, and critically, the law states that no record shall be withheld, delayed, or redacted on the basis of embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity, including to any government official, public figure, or foreign dignitary, which explicitly prevents the DOJ from using the usual excuses to protect powerful people. And yet here we are with Massie warning that the DOJ is going to try to do exactly that, by releasing only the grand jury material and keeping everything else secret because they never brought it before a grand jury in the first place. This is the architecture of impunity operating in plain sight, and what makes it so maddening is that we have the documentary evidence, we have the flight logs and the emails and the witness statements and the financial records. We have everything needed to expose the full scope of this network, except that the institutions entrusted with administering justice have instead chosen to administer selective amnesia, and you can see the panic and the reactions of powerful people as this law moved forward because Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted that the Epstein rape and pedophile network must be exposed and to release all the Epstein information by any means possible, adding that if something happens to me, ask you all to find out who might be trying to stop the information from coming out, which indicates that even members of Congress pushing for transparency feel threatened by the forces aligned against disclosure. Now I have profound political disagreements with Greene on virtually everything, but when she's making arguments about exposing elite pedophile networks alongside progressive Democrats like Ro Khanna, that tells you something about how this issue transcends normal political divisions, because protecting children should not be a partisan issue, and exposing their abusers should not require courage, because it should be the bare minimum expectation of any legitimate justice system. The survivors themselves have been extraordinarily brave in coming forward. One survivor, Jane Elisa Jones, held up a photo of herself when she was 14, the age when she met Epstein, saying, "I was a child, I was in 9th grade, I was hopeful for life, and what the future had held for me. He stole a lot from me." And when you hear testimony like that, you understand viscerally what we're really talking about here, which is not abstract questions of government transparency, but the most fundamental questions of justice and accountability, and whether our society has any moral core whatsoever. These were children, 9th graders, whose lives were destroyed by wealthy predators who believed their money and connections placed them above the law, and they were right to believe that because the evidence shows they largely have been above the law. Epstein got a sweetheart deal in 2008, where he pleaded guilty to charges of solicitation of prostitution with a minor, served 13 months in a minimum security prison, and was allowed to leave for 12 hours a day to work, which is not justice by any conceivable definition. That is the justice system providing cover for elite criminality. And here's what should terrify every American regardless of political affiliation: the fact that the Department of Justice is now probing the conduct of at least 2 top Trump administration officials for allegedly interfering with and potentially jeopardizing ongoing criminal investigations of the president's political adversaries, specifically whether U.S. Pardon Attorney Ed Martin and Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte enlisted individuals outside the Department of Justice to probe allegations, which reveals that the rot extends beyond concealment into active manipulation of investigative processes for political purposes. You have Ed Martin holding 4 separate titles, including Pardon Attorney, Special Attorney for Mortgage Fraud, Associate Deputy Attorney General, and Director of the DOJ's Weaponization Working Group, while conducting what amounts to rogue investigations outside proper channels, and the disturbing reality is that this is happening while legitimate investigations into elite criminality are being suppressed. The priorities could not be more perverse, where resources are devoted to investigating the president's enemies, while evidence of child sex trafficking networks that implicate the president's friends remains locked away. The legal architecture that enables this concealment is itself worthy of serious examination, because we have layer upon layer of doctrines and precedents and procedures that were ostensibly created to protect legitimate interests, but function in practice to protect power. Grand jury secrecy is one such doctrine, and yes, it serves important purposes in protecting witnesses and preserving investigative integrity, but it becomes a tool of elite protection when prosecutors deliberately withhold evidence from grand juries, precisely so that evidence can later be shielded behind grand jury secrecy rules. The same applies to national security classifications and victim privacy protections and all the other legal mechanisms that get deployed to prevent disclosure, each individually defensible, but collectively functioning as an impenetrable barrier between criminal elites and accountability. And the victims of this system are not just the direct victims of Epstein's crimes, though their suffering is immeasurable and primary, but all of us who are forced to live in a society where the powerful can commit atrocities with impunity, while ordinary people are incarcerated for poverty and desperation. The timeline of resistance to this transparency is itself revelatory, because Representative Thomas Massie filed a discharge petition in September 2025, and on November 12 the discharge petition received the minimum required 218 signatures needed, forcing a House vote on the bill, which means Massie had to go around House leadership and use a parliamentary maneuver to force a vote that leadership did not want. And the reason they didn't want it is transparently obvious. It's because both parties contain members who are either implicated themselves, or who are protecting people who are implicated, or who benefit from the networks of power and influence that would be exposed by full disclosure. Trump administration officials called helping Massie and liberal Democrats with their attention-seeking a very hostile act to the administration, while the DOJ claimed to be fully supporting a more comprehensive file release effort, which is bureaucratic doublespeak, for we will pretend to support transparency, while actually obstructing it at every turn. When you examine how the contemporary Department of Justice has been reshaped, you see systematic prioritization of certain enforcement areas, while others are deliberately neglected, and the pattern reveals clear class bias in how prosecutorial resources are deployed. The Criminal Division released a white-collar enforcement plan describing priorities, and the Deputy Attorney General issued guidelines for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigations and enforcement. And while some of these reforms claim to enhance accountability, what they actually do is narrow the scope of enforcement to exclude the kinds of elite criminality that are most destructive. The new FCPA guidelines, for example, focus enforcement on matters involving cartels and transnational criminal organizations, and matters that harm U.S. economic interests, which sounds reasonable until you realize this framework excludes all kinds of corrupt conduct by American elites operating domestically or in ways that don't fit these narrow categories. This is how you construct a justice system that appears to be functioning while actually providing safe harbor for the politically connected. The reporting on internal DOJ processes is genuinely chilling because Leopold reported that FBI personnel worked 4,737 overtime hours, costing over $851,000, to redact files related to the Epstein investigation through what was internally referred to as the Special Redaction Project or Epstein Transparency Project. And the Orwellian naming convention alone should make you furious because they're calling it a transparency project, while spending nearly $1 million to conceal information. This is the banality of evil in administrative form. Thousands of hours of labor by FBI employees whose job is not to investigate crimes or protect victims, but to protect powerful criminals from exposure. Every one of those hours represents time not spent investigating ongoing trafficking networks, not spent pursuing leads on other predators, but instead spent carefully redacting documents to ensure that certain names remain hidden, and the fact that this required thousands of hours of overtime suggests just how extensive the evidence is, how many powerful people are implicated, how much effort it takes to sanitize the record before it can be released. What Representative Massie is demanding when he says the grand jury material isn't enough is actually quite radical if you think about it, because he's demanding that we see not just the evidence that prosecutors chose to present, but all the evidence they chose to suppress. That would expose prosecutorial decision-making in ways that would fundamentally alter public understanding of how the justice system actually operates, because we would see in black and white all the leads not pursued, all the witnesses not interviewed, all the financial trails not followed, all the powerful people deliberately excluded from investigation, despite evidence of their involvement. This is why institutional actors are so desperate to prevent this release. It's not just about protecting specific individuals, though that's certainly part of it. It's about protecting the entire system of selective prosecution that maintains elite impunity. Once the public sees how prosecutors deliberately limited their investigation to avoid implicating powerful people, the legitimacy of the entire prosecutorial function comes into question, and Americans start asking why we should trust these institutions at all. The survivors who have come forward deserve recognition for their extraordinary courage because Representative Khanna said Jeffrey Epstein literally set up an island of rape, a rape island, and you had rich and powerful men, some of the richest people in the world, who thought they could hang out with bankers, buy off politicians, and abuse and rape America's girls with no consequence, and that description captures the essence of how elite criminality functions in late-stage capitalism. It's not just individual deviant behavior. It's systematic. It's networked. It involves financial infrastructure, and political protection, and media complicity, and prosecutorial discretion, all working together to create zones of impunity where the rules that govern everyone else simply don't apply. And Khanna is right that because survivors spoke up, because of their courage, the truth is finally going to come out, and when it comes out, this country is really going to have a moral reckoning, and that moral reckoning needs to be comprehensive, because it can't just be about Epstein, or even just about the specific powerful men who participated in these crimes. It has to be about the entire architecture of elite impunity that made these crimes possible and profitable for so long. Consider the broader context of how this administration has approached questions of accountability and transparency across domains, because the Epstein Files case is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. The Civil Service Reform Act helped foster an informal accountability system of career DOJ employees dedicated to nonpartisan application of the department's powers, and the Watergate scandal prompted Congress to pass the Ethics in Government Act, which created the Office of Government Ethics to oversee the federal ethics program. And all of these post-Watergate reforms represented a social compact where Americans agreed that never again would we allow this kind of abuse of power. And yet here we are 50 years later watching those same protections systematically dismantled. The institutional memory that remembers why these safeguards were created is being purged from agencies as career professionals are replaced by political loyalists, whose primary allegiance is not to the Constitution or to justice, but to power itself. The discharge petition process that Massie used is itself a fascinating case study in how democratic accountability sometimes requires working against party leadership, because Massie and Democratic co-author Ro Khanna began collecting signatures starting in September 2025, needing at least 218 signatures to force a vote, and Khanna said he was certain that all 212 Democrats would sign on along with at least 6 Republican, which reveals that rank-and-file Democrats were uniformly willing to support transparency, while Republican leadership and the Trump administration were fighting tooth and nail to prevent it. This should shatter any illusions about both sides because yes, both parties contain members who are implicated or complicit, but the institutional response was asymmetric, with one party's leadership actively working to suppress evidence, while the other party's caucus voted unanimously to release it. That doesn't mean Democrats are saints. It means on this specific issue of elite accountability for child sex trafficking, one party behaved better than the other, and we have to be able to acknowledge that without losing sight of the larger structural critique. The obstruction from Republican leadership was remarkably brazen, because GOP leaders added their own Epstein-related bill to the House schedule, but the bill had little teeth, as it would merely direct the Oversight Committee to continue its ongoing investigation, and Massie said Speaker Johnson just scheduled this meaningless vote to provide political cover for those members who don't support our bipartisan legislation to force the release of the Epstein files, which is such a perfect example of how institutional power operates to create the appearance of action while preventing actual accountability. You schedule a vote on a bill that does nothing, so members can tell constituents they voted on Epstein transparency while actually voting for continued concealment. This is the sophisticated machinery of elite protection in action, not crude cover-up, but elaborate procedural theater designed to satisfy public demands for accountability while ensuring no actual accountability occurs. Speaker Johnson's stated concerns about the discharge petition are also worth examining, because he said the petition was inartfully drafted and would not protect the identities of victims, stating that many of these young women, some of them now middle-aged women, have never come forward, and we do not want their names or identities to be uncovered carelessly or intentionally in any way. And while victim protection is obviously crucial, this rhetoric functions as concern trolling, designed to delay and obstruct release. The actual text of the legislation explicitly protects victim identities, and the real concern is not about victims, but about perpetrators and enablers, whose names would finally be exposed. This is how power protects itself, by appropriating the language of protection and care, while actually protecting predators from consequences. The fact that before the vote members of Congress, including Democrat Ro Khanna and Republicans Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, spoke alongside survivors of Epstein's abuse, and Massie told reporters they fought the president, the attorney general, the FBI director, the Speaker of the House, and the Vice President to get this win really drives home how comprehensive the resistance to transparency has been. Every single power center in the executive branch and congressional leadership was aligned against disclosure, and the only reason the bill passed is because rank-and-file members forced a vote, and the political optics of voting against Epstein transparency became untenable. But even then, the lone no vote on the bill came from Republican Representative Clay Higgins, a fervent Trump supporter now in his 5th term, and his stated reason was that the bill would harm innocent people, but the subtext is transparent, which is that he was signaling loyalty to Trump and to the powerful interests that want this concealed. When we talk about systemic change and transformative politics, this is precisely the kind of issue that should unite people across the political spectrum, because protecting children from predators and holding elite criminals accountable are not left-wing or right-wing values. They're basic human values, and the fact that institutional power is so thoroughly arrayed against transparency on this issue reveals how corrupt and captured our institutions have become. The project of building a more just society requires dismantling these architecture of impunity, requires creating mechanisms of accountability that actually function regardless of how wealthy or powerful the accused might be, requires transparency as a default rather than as a concession grudgingly made after months of pressure and parliamentary maneuvering. And here's what should keep you up at night. If this is how hard it is to get transparency on one of the most notorious criminal cases in recent American history, involving a convicted sex trafficker whose crimes are documented and whose victims have testified publicly, imagine how impossible it is to get accountability for elite crimes that are less spectacular or less well documented or that don't happen to capture public attention. For every Epstein case that becomes a national scandal, there are hundreds of instances of elite criminality that never get investigated at all, thousands of decisions by prosecutors not to pursue powerful defendants, endless examples of the justice system sorting people into categories of who deserves prosecution and who deserves protection, based not on guilt or innocence but on power and connection and class. This is the lived reality of American justice, and the Epstein Files case is merely the most visible example of dynamics that structure the entire system. Representative Massie warned explicitly about the smokescreen dynamic where opening new investigations creates legal barriers to releasing documents, because if they have ongoing investigations in certain areas, those documents can't be released. So this might be a big smokescreen to open a bunch of investigations, as a last-ditch effort to prevent the release of the Epstein files, Pakol the Ban, and this is such sophisticated obstruction that it reveals how institutional actors, who want to prevent accountability, can weaponize the very procedures designed to ensure accountability. You open investigations not to pursue justice but to create legal barriers to disclosure. You cite ongoing investigative needs, not because you're actually investigating, but because that citation prevents transparency. The rule of law becomes a shield for lawlessness when those administering the law are more committed to protecting power than pursuing justice. So here we are in December 2025, with the 30-day deadline approaching, and the DOJ claiming it will comply while Massie and other members of Congress are warning that compliance will be hollow because the documents released will be only a fraction of what exists, only what prosecutors chose to put before grand juries, while everything they chose to suppress remains concealed. This is not accountability. This is kabuki theater. This is the performance of transparency, while the substance remains hidden. And the only way this changes is through sustained pressure from an informed and mobilized public that demands actual transparency and real accountability and refuses to accept procedural excuses and legal technicalities as justification for continued concealment. The survivors deserve justice, the public deserves truth, and children deserve protection from predators, regardless of how wealthy and powerful those predators might be. This is the moral test of our time, and the question is whether enough Americans care enough to demand that our institutions finally choose justice over elite protection, because right now the evidence suggests they will continue protecting power unless we make it impossible for them to do so.